Welcome to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. I am Tammi Mac on Fox Soul. The Voting Rights Act, signed into law in 1965 by President Lyndon B. Johnson, outlawed discriminatory voting practices at the state and local level. But the conservative Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, with Chief Justice Roberts saying, the country has changed. So as people are headed to the polls, are Black people being blocked from voting? Let's get down to business. The business of being Black today is Blacks being blocked from voting. Please welcome the Director of the Mayor's Office, LGBTQ Affairs for Baltimore, Mayor Brandon Scott, London de Richelieu. Hi, London.
Good morning. Well, good evening, Tammy. How are you?
Fine. The founder of Uncommon Sense Media Group and a member of Project 21, Craig DeLuz, is here. Hi, Craig.
Pleasure to be with you again.
The Chief Political Officer for Democracy for America, Chris Scott. Hey.
Thanks so much for having me, Tammy.
And the host of the Officer Tatum Show and podcast, Brandon Tatum, is on board. Hello, Brandon.
How are you?
Just fine. So let's start with why Black people should care. Why should Black people care if they're being blocked from voting? I know it seems like a pretty obvious answer to the question, but maybe you can shed some perspective. Brandon, let's go.
Well, I think that this is a myth to think that Black people being blocked from voting. I don't know what restriction is in place that prevents a Black person from getting an identification, going to the voter booth and going and putting in their vote, or they can mail in the vote. Whichever way they choose to vote, there's no legitimate obstruction of Black people voting. The only obstruction that I think would exist is if people are not talking about voting, if the parents are not telling their young people to get out and vote. That's the only obstruction that I see.
So you're saying Black people shouldn't be concerned about being blocked from voting because it doesn't exist?
They should be concerned about the lie that they're being blocked, because then I think that deters them from going out to vote. But they shouldn't believe that there's an obstruction, go out and vote like everybody else in the country.
All right. Why should Black people care, London, if they're being blocked from voting?
Well, whites have had historical pressures that have been bestowed upon us, like literacy, poverty. Those were the things that prevented us in the past from being able to vote. Those are the blocks are put up. But however, they are the ones who bestowed them upon us, right? Things like being able to obtain an ID, those seem very, very simple, are very hard in some states. There are different laws and systematic things put into place as to how you can get your ID, how you can acquire a real ID, and correcting those issues like being able to do same-day voting, being able to do mail-in ballots are ways that we can address Blacks being unable to vote.
Yeah, but why should Black people care?
Well, Black people should care. Well, for one, we should care because the 14th and 15th Amendment gave us the right. Our ancestors and our progenitors have died. They've marched, they've cried, and they've died so that we have the right. And so many have been so apathetic and just not cared. And the thing is that if the same people vote, then we're going to get the same results. And if the same people don't vote, we're going to still get the same results. So it's time to get up and make the change and vote.
All right, Chris, why should Black people care about being blocked from voting? That's the question at task right now. Why should Black people care?
We have to care. If we're ever going to have an America that really provides equality, that means everybody with the most basic right in America has to have access to the ballot box. And, Brandon said a lot of strong things, but they're simply lies. It's the fact that in 2020, when you saw a historic turnout from Black people voting, the next year you had over 19 states passed 34 restrictive voting rights law. Now, if there was no problem with Black people voting, why pass all those laws in the year after you have a historic turnout? Black people have to care because it's the first step to having the full equality that we need to keep progressing America forward.
Craig, why should Black people care? I'm Black. Why should I care if they block me from voting? Or
honestly, I'm just going to give an addendum. I'm going to give an addendum to what Officer Tatum had to share. The fact is, the information that was just provided is in fact false. The reality is, in 2020, there were a lot of changes that were made to voting laws throughout the country. Many of them were not even passed by local legislators, but were simply put in place by election officials. What happened in 2021 was, in many cases, they either had to ratify some of those changes, and in some cases, they pared them back in order to make them more equal across all districts or across all counties in those areas. And in some cases, they just flat out ratify them. But keep in mind, in most cases, the voting is not more restrictive than it was, say, in 2018. In fact, they had way more early voting days. It was much easier to vote early in most states. And by the way, if I can just add one thing, what the Voting Rights Act did was it made it so that certain states which had a history of discrimination, in particular against Black people at the polls, it restricted their ability to be able to change their election laws. And what's happened in recent times, now mind you, this was over 60 years ago. So what happened in more modern times is those states are no longer controlled by the racist Democrats who controlled those states at the time. So what they're saying is these states should now have the ability to make changes to their voting laws without having to get the approval of the federal government.
And why should Black people care, Craig?
Well, I think we should care because the information that we are being provided is not always accurate. Unfortunately, mainstream media, academia, and in many cases, ethnic media are not providing us with accurate information.
I do want to touch on this accurate information thing because Brandon also said that we're being fed lies, and anyone can chime in here. If there are people saying, hey, that's a lie on one side, and then people saying, hey, that's a lie on the other side, and both parties are giving their perspective facts, how do the people know what's real and what's not?
When it comes to election law, how about this? How about you actually read the legislation? I debated, for example, the Georgia election law at least a dozen times. And every single time, no one was able to go to a particular area within the legislation and tell me exactly how it was restrictive based on race. All they could come up with was, oh, well, those racist Republicans, they put this forward. And the fact that they were racist, it was like using the legislation as evidence that they were racist. But they were racist, so therefore the legislation is bad.
Brandon,
may I intervene?
Yeah, I'll just say I want to piggyback off what Craig said and just kind of I guess fulfill what I was saying that Chris I guess denied the facts of is that we see record turnout in Georgia. More Black people turn out to vote in Georgia than in any point, I believe, in Georgia history. So the laws are in place to protect everybody and make sure that you have a right to vote and make sure that other people are not voting on your behalf. If you have to have an identification, that is a plus for Black people in the Black community, because that makes sure and assures that you have a fair election and that your vote will count and that you're the only person that can show up and vote on your behalf, or your family members are actually going to the voting booth and actually their votes are being counted. So it's a myth because politicians need something to talk about. They need something to argue. They need you to vote for them to change things that are not even true. There's not one Black person that's on this entire panel that can say that there's a single law that's restricting them from going out and voting today.
Hold that thought, Chris. London wanted to jump in.
No, well, I just wanted to say, and you mentioned around there being two sides, and oftentimes, and you know how the three branches work, is that the judicial side is left to interpret the law. And we're talking about legislation, and right now what's going on with the case is the proponents of that case are bringing up the U.S. Constitutional Election Clause, right? And it's like right now we politicize the courts, and because the courts are politicized, when we leave it up to who's supposed to be able to interpret the legislation, it's being chose on a bipartisan way, being Republican or Democrat, which is completely unfair to those on both sides.
Chris?
So let's talk about this, Brandon. Let's look at Florida, where Ron DeSantis just brought up criminal charges against 19 people, 15 of them being Black. Florida passes a law to allow people that have been disenfranchised, that are returned citizens, to vote. Yet, he doesn't want them to vote because you saw more of those people make an impact in an election in 2018. Let's talk about Georgia. Let's talk about how Brian Kemp, even when he was running for governor, was the sitting Secretary of State and purged so many people from the voting rolls and ends up winning by a margin of 32,000 votes. And then after a historic election that you mentioned, that more Black people turn out in Georgia in 2020, you pass one of the most restrictive voting rights laws in the entire country, not just the South, the entire country. So let's talk about
that. Is not true. That is not true. In fact,
why do that? Why the voting? I think we can agree that the voting laws we did see a major change in voting laws after the most recent election. Why is that?
Well,
right, because the voter turnout,
as I said in the beginning, there were major changes in most states when it came to election law because of COVID. And the changes that were made in many states were either to put things back to the way they were or to incorporate some of those changes, some of those expansions that took place. That's why those changes were in fact made. And by the way, voting laws, for example, in the president's state of Delaware are far more restrictive than those in Georgia. How about Colorado, where the Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game from Georgia to Colorado? Once again, a state that has far more restrictive voting laws than does Georgia.
Wait. You want to talk about Colorado, a state where literally the Secretary of State has to protect election officials, where they have to put up bulletproof glass because the rise of conservative extremism is threatening election officials.
I'm sorry. I thought we were talking about voting laws.
Democracy and make
I thought we were talking about voting laws
easier.
I thought we were talking about passing laws that were restrictive.
Well, Craig, I mean, you brought up Colorado, Craig, so I think it's only fair that
my point is, he said these are the most restrictive laws in the entire country. I just named 2 states. I could go and name more that have far more restrictive laws than is the new law in Georgia.
Well, this is what I think, Chris. This is what I think, Chris, you're missing out on. Chris, this is what I think you're missing out on. In the state of Florida, you see more black turnout for Ron DeSantis than he had in the past. So why in the world would Ron DeSantis want to restrict black votes when black voters are the ones putting him in the office? Same thing with Brian Kemp. You know, you have Kemp out in Georgia, and there are black people that are voting. More black males are voting for Republicans. So why would Republicans restrict votes of black individuals if they're turning out more for Republicans than they were in the past?
That's a great question. We'll answer it when we come back on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. I'm Tammi Mac on Fox Soul. In the Business of Being Black today, are black people being blocked from voting? The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore the Voting Rights Act in part by requiring states with a history of voter discrimination to receive approval from the Department of Justice before enacting voting changes. So why should black people be for or against this act? Chris?
Black people should be for this act because it is the only way that they can be sure that their right to vote is going to stay protected. This country has a history when we leave it up to the states to peel back and roll back the hands of time and restrict more people to be able to fundamentally exercise their American right, that is to vote.
Brandon?
Well, I think that I do not believe that most black people should be acquiescing to these laws that are on a federal level. We need to get the federal government out of states' rights, states' laws, and let the state deal with it. There's nobody on this panel, and I will challenge anybody on this panel. Name an obstruction to you showing up and voting in November. Name one obstruction. We all on here are black.
Having a felony. Having a felony. Having been 1.85.
Do anybody on this panel have a felony?
Not myself, but being one of the 5.85 million Americans who are not able to vote because they are in states that have restrictions and are disenfranchised.
Right. Florida is not one of those states. Florida's not one of those states. One of my good friends, he had a felony on his record. He got it he got his record clean. He can now vote and own a gun. So there's ways for you to get back your rights to vote and to own a gun. And many of
that goes back to state laws. That goes back to state laws. These are all things that are put on the books by each state individual.
But I think that people know that before they commit a felony, that if you commit a violent crime or a felony, you may lose your right to vote and you may lose your right to a firearm. And I'll say this, everybody that's in prison right now don't have the right to vote. So there's consequences for actions. I'm talking about people who are eligible to vote, people who are out and productive members of society.
But what about restorative justice and rehabilitative justice, right? So how are you denying people? You claim that you've rehabilitated them and that they've done their time.
Which state are you referring to?
Hold that thought, Brandon. Let her complete her thought. Go ahead, London.
Okay. Well, I'm talking about 5.85 million according to ACLU. That's what I'm talking about in various states. There's states from Iowa. I mean, I could go down if I need to be able to pull up and go through each individual state. I mean, I know I'm from the state of Maryland, and we don't have those issues in the state of Maryland. But there are states that do prohibit and stop you from being able to vote if you are a felon. And
But I don't think that's.
Then how about this? How about we once again? I'll go back. How about we do this? How about we just not commit crimes? How about we
hold that thought, Craig?
Then there's also the
hold that thought, Craig. I want London to complete her thought.
Okay.
Go ahead, London.
Okay, so again, and then that goes back to us talking about criminal justice reform and all the systematic barriers that have been put into place by those that have been in power historically, right? And these are the things that they bestowed upon us and the civilizations that they've created, right? Things that have started way beyond, before our grandparents. I mean, started with slavery, right? So these things are, when we look at like how, when we talk about criminal justice and we talk about felons who can't vote, we have to also look at the criminal justice system and how the people that we're putting into office are further extenuating those circumstances.
But there's no such thing as a black felony and a white felony.
Sounds like an incredibly racist, because I'm like, okay, well, black people should care because of felons. So you're acting as if most, if not all, black people are felons. Black people should care because voter ID. As if black people can't get a state identification. To me, it is the most demeaning and belittling. The truth is that none of these laws, as has already been stated, prevent anyone from being able to vote. Nobody is treated any differently. And when we talk about what is going on historically, we're talking about laws that were in place or things that were being done 70 years ago, for which a law was passed 60 years ago. And as I said before, largely the racist Democrats who were in charge of those elections, they're not in charge anymore. So I'm not understanding.
I would beg to say the racist Congress and the racist Senate
we want to talk about history as if it was last year or last month.
We're feeling the effects of it still now. We're still feeling the effects today.
No, we're not.
I want to get back to the question that Brandon, I want to get back to the question that Brandon talked about, but I do want to respond to Craig real quick and say, if we're talking about history and we're talking about who's racist, I think we can say the racist Democrats and Republicans and the racist people in the Senate and the Congress in 1965. I don't think we can separate the parties from being racist at a certain point in our history. Chris, Brandon asked the question.
Voted for the Voting Rights Act and for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a higher percentage than Democrats.
Okay.
It must be nice to make up the facts as you go.
Praise God for that, I guess.
I'm not making up facts. You look it up.
I want to touch on Brandon's question, though. Brandon mentioned a couple of politicians that were elected by a large group and number of Republicans, a large group of Black people, and particularly Black men who are voting and leaning more Republican. So, Chris, how do you speak to that? Why would Ron DeSantis try to stop Black people from voting if Black people are voting for him?
Well, one, let's be honest that, incremental, tiny increase, we're talking about 1%, 2%, 3% in some cases. And we're playing on the fact that this is a country that pretty much still upholds the patriarchy. Let's talk about playing to people's fears and how you get them to go more in another direction. Let's just play up the fear. At the end of the day, when we're talking about criminals, because I want to go back to Craig's point, because he made a real strong statement about people being criminals and not making the crime. Let's talk about all the people in the insurrection. Let's talk about the elected officials that went up to the Capitol, committed crimes, and are still elected in office. So you need to be very careful when we're talking about what criminal acts
if they are convicted of felonies, they will lose their rights to vote as well.
These are people that are making
laws due process.
That's a straw man argument, because if they're convicted of felonies, they should lose their right to vote as well.
It's called due process. They have due process, so that
we know
they'll have their day in court.
Justice system doesn't allow for due process, Brandon. Yeah. We know that it preys on Black people and brown people.
I disagree. I disagree with you.
We know
that.
Look, you are entitled to your opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts.
I want to go back to, hold on, Craig, I'm going to come back to you. But Brandon, you wanted to talk about Florida, right? And what is Ron DeSantis that's doing? What is he doing that's restrictive? Again, he just arrested 19 people. 15 of them were Black. 15 of them have just had their voting rights restored that have been passed as a state law in Florida, yet you're still trying to arrest them and take away that right. So it must be nice to make whatever fairy tale you want in reality, but the facts are the facts. And everybody can see that as clear as day.
So let's talk about this fact real quick. In 2016, a U.S. appeals court struck down a North Carolina voter ID law that they said targeted African-American voters with almost surgical precision. A second North Carolina voter ID law from 2018 was struck down last year with a court saying it intentionally discriminated against Black voters. So were the courts correct in those instances?
I would argue we would have to look at the courts because we know that there's some courts that are politicized either one way or the other. But how in the world is it racist for you to have an identification? I don't understand that. You go and get an identification to drive a car. I mean, you have to have a driver's license. You fly on an airplane. You buy alcohol. You go stay at a hotel to get food stamps, government assistance. You have to have identification. I don't know a Black person that don't have identification. So when people say that IDs are restrictive, I think IDs are beneficial to all people in America because therefore you can ensure that
you have to have an address. You have to have an address. You have to have an address to get an ID. Firstly, right? If you don't have an address, how can you get an ID? So that's not a black thing. Well, it's not a black issue, but we must admit that there are higher levels of poverty. We must admit that there are higher levels of poverty and homelessness amongst Black community, right? So
how many people do not possess or do not have an address that are attempting to vote? Give me a number. It's inconsequential.
But there is no way to prove an exact number.
But it's inconsequential. There's a lot of people, majority of Black people have IDs, majority of Black people have homes, majority of Black people have the ability to go out and vote.
Let's hold that thought and come right back so I can keep my home. We're going to go to commercial break. How about that? Welcome back to the Business of Being Black. Today, the business of being Black is, are Blacks being blocked from voting? Please welcome the Director of the Mayor's Office, LGBTQ Affairs for Baltimore, Mayor Brandon Scott, London DeRishelle Yu, the founder of Uncommon Sense Media Group and a member of Project 21, Craig DeLuz, and the Chief Political Officer for Democracy for America, Chris Scott, and the host of the Officer Tatum Show and podcast, Brandon Tatum. Thank you all for being here. This conversation is a little more heated than I anticipated, but I'm loving every single minute of it, and the facts you're bringing are making me just melt inside. Craig, you wanted to talk about Florida.
Yes. So the incident, what occurred in Florida was Broward County decided to send out voter registration cards to everybody. And you had 20 people, in particular, many were felons, 15 of them, well, they were all felons, who received voter registration cards and registered to vote. That's what occurred. And by the way, they knew that because they were felons, they were not supposed to be voting. And that's why, in fact, they were arrested for basically voter fraud. They were ineligible to vote, and they decided to vote. There was no change in the law. I have no idea what Chris is talking about, but that is an example of the misinformation, or rather disinformation, that you're hearing from folks regarding issues like this.
Chris, you want to respond?
Yeah, so the fact that you don't know of the law that gave felons, once they re-enter society, that was passed in Florida to stop that disenfranchisement is appalling, honestly. You want to talk about misinformation. But I want to go back to Brandon's point. Brandon wanted to talk about, having an ID and it not really being restrictive. But you look at the fact that when a Black person makes a mistake, say they go to the wrong precinct, which did happen down in Texas, you wanted to charge that woman with 6 years to put her in prison. You got a woman in Arizona, a white woman, forged her dead grandmother's name, and she gets probation? And we want to talk about this is fair? We know we don't live in a fair society. We know that Black and brown people get penalized way more. And when it comes to voting rights, it has been an intentional obstruction of justice to keep turning back the clock. You want the old Jim Crow days because you're losing your power, and you feel that as we're building a more representative democracy. It's interesting, as we've seen a rise in Black candidates, we've also seen a rise in more restrictive voting laws across the country.
Let's talk about turning back the clock. Let's talk about turning back the clock, Brandon. Should the Voting Rights Act of 1965 still be in effect? I mean, we can't, let me start here. We can't agree that there was a reason that Black people marched on Washington to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Can we at least agree on that part?
Yeah, I think we agree, but I think we're far beyond that at this point. You know, like I said, we are 100% that every single person on this panel, everybody that's involved in this, have a right to vote. No obstruction to vote. We can all go out and vote. We have no issues. Nobody can say they don't have identification.
We sit in a place of privilege. Like we sit in a place of privilege. I don't want to listen. You can't use us as the example.
Listen. Most black people are not in poverty. Most Black people do not live in the hood. So the majority of Black people that live in this country have every right and ability to vote, and they are turning out and they are voting. So I don't understand.
By the way,
this is the problem. This is the problem that we see.
25% of Black voters don't have an ID. 25% of Black voters don't have an ID.
That is not true.
Can I finish?
It's 13%. It's less than 13%.
Can I finish?
Who's your source?
No. Can I finish? So even if that's true, if 13% or 25% of Black people don't have an ID, then how about Black people get out and help other Black people get identification? Because there's no law in place that says you can't get an identification.
Now we're victims.
If you want one, you can go get one. And in many cases, you can get one for free. You can get an identification. Right. You can go register to vote. The problem is...
Let me just speak from being a Black trans woman.
Wait a second. Okay. I'll let you finish. Wait a second. It's cultural. It's cultural. We don't raise our young people to have importance on voting. When I grew up, I'll just give anecdotal evidence. When I grew up, nobody voted, nobody cared. Now that I'm grown, I understand the importance of voting. My son knows about voting. Everybody I talk to, I encourage them to show up and vote. It is not the white man's fault that Black people are not turning out to vote. It is our fault.
Why would you
hold that thought, Chris? I want to get London. Hold that thought, Chris. Let's get London's point across here. Go ahead, London.
Okay. So we do agree that there is apathy with voting, right? I agree with you that people are apathetic about voting, and there are multiple reasons as to why there is. But let me just harken back to something. As a Black trans woman, right? And I sit in a place of privilege, but there are many who don't have access to the documents needed that go ahead and establish you being able to get an ID, right? Like getting things like your birth certificate, your social security card. Some people would rather identify as how in their gender identity and how they are rather than what the state says that they are. And again, that goes back to state laws. And when you start to talk about, the antiquated South and how, trans people are forced to get surgeries and do all these things to get identification that matches who they are, that's a problem. And yes, there are 25% of African Americans do not have ID, opposed to 8% of white Americans who have identification. And so, yes, creating restrictions based on ID is a problem. And I live in a state of Maryland who does not restrict you based on
Nobody is stopping. Look, the other thing is keep in mind that the Voting Rights Act and the law that, in fact, that Democrats are seeking to pass in Congress right now doesn't affect every state. It only affects certain states. And it's interesting that those states happen to be majority Republican states or states that are largely controlled by Republicans. It's a political ploy. If you really wanted it to affect all states, then you would, if you really wanted equality, then you would make it affect all states.
It's funny that
we have a historical fact that some states sought to suppress the vote more than others. Some states did not have the same number of.
What state do you live in, Chris? What state do you live in?
I live in Virginia right now. Want to talk about Virginia? I live in Texas.
Are you able to go and vote like the white man? Can you go out and vote like the white man?
I can vote like a regular person.
I'm just saying, you act like there's different. But you act like the laws.
No, because I want to go back to the point. Again, but if I happen to accidentally go to the wrong polling place, there's not a guarantee that I'm not going to get charged with voter fraud. We just talked about that.
Listen, you're making this up. You're making this up.
That's not making it.
You have to read. You have to read the letter of the law. So when you go to a voting place and you vote intentionally to defraud the system, that is a crime. There's a culpable mental state. You have to be. It has to be intentional. If you somehow go to a let me just explain to you. Let me just explain to you how voting works. In the state of Arizona, you go to the wrong polling place, they will not accept you because your name is not on the voter roll. So if you somehow thwart that process,
there is something called a provisional ballot.
Yeah,
You
yes,
do realize that,
we have
right?
those in Maryland.
You do understand what a provisional ballot is. But no, let's go back. No. Let's go back to your
with
point
a provisional
about
ballot.
Hold that thought, Brandon. Let me let Chris get his point out.
Let's go back to the point about that you made about politicizing the courts. The conservatives, the GOP, you want to talk about politicizing the court? Let's look at what's going on with the Supreme Court, the most conservative court in the history of the Supreme Court.
God.
And what they have done. Thank God.
It is amazing to me. When they make a decision that you agree with, well, that's justice. When they make a decision that you disagree with, it's politicized.
Craig. It's not your time, Craig.
I'm listening, Chris. Go ahead.
Let's talk about how you're trying to create the Handmaid's Tale and bring that to real life with the Dobbs decision. And if you tried it out with just repealing a woman's right to
allowing
choose
states
and
to
the
make
rights to her body, what's next? It's voting rights, which already got brought up with the case in Alabama. You're going after marriage equality now. So don't talk to me about the politicization of the court. Y'all do it better than anybody.
It's funny. Once again, when we go back, you have a Supreme Court right now that is saying the law is the law. Their goal is not social change. Their goal is, what does the Constitution say? The job of the courts is to interpret the law relating to as it pertains to the Constitution. That is what the Supreme Court is doing. I'm sorry that you don't like it, but that's what the job of the court is. Unfortunately, and fortunately, they are making decisions that, quite frankly, I believe are best for America.
And
now, that's really kind of off the discussion.
Chris,
we still haven't gotten into how exactly are Black people disenfranchised or being kept or blocked from voting?
Well, on that note of silence, I don't want to block this commercial break, so let's be right back. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. I am Tammi Mac. In the business of being Black today, are Blacks being blocked from voting? Oh, that's a tongue twister. Are Blacks being blocked on Business of Being Black? London.
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump back and talk about, judicial interpretation for a second. So, different judges are going to interpret the laws of their state or their country in different ways, right? But what we have at this point right now are we have judges that are trying to legislate from the bench, right? They're trying to create new laws from the bench. They're not interpreting from a judicial lens, or an equitable lens. They're coming from a conservative lens.
Let me jump in there real quick. There's no legislating. They determine.
They made a new law.
Can you let me finish?
What new law?
They've determined that the Roe v. Wade was not constitutionally protected.
Therefore,
they leave it up to the states.
So they exploited it because it wasn't constitutional.
It's left up to the states. It's left up to the states like it's supposed to. Now, if you don't like abortion or you are pro-abortion in your state, you vote for those individuals. And Chris, let me correct you on one thing. You're making up terminology. There's no such thing in what you're saying is pro-choice or women's choice. You mean the right to murder a child. It's not choice.
Wow.
A woman has a choice. She has a choice to give
the right to murder a child.
She have a choice.
Your conservatives do it the best.
No.
We're not even
have a choice to have a child.
You want to talk about murdering children?
The number one cause of death for Black children is abortion, more than all the other causes put together. Come on now.
God, you have more.
Come on now. Look,
have more white women that get abortions
Parenthood has
than Black
succeeded
women.
where the
It doesn't matter. Abortion is wrong regardless.
So let's save the abortion for the abortion conversation and focus on the voting conversation here. Some say that the election of a Black president, Barack Obama, was evidence that the Voting Rights Act is no longer necessary. Do we agree with this? Is the appearance of a Black president an example of why we no longer need the Voting Rights Act, London?
Let me just say this. So Voters' Rights Act, and when we look at the minority majority clause, like when it's creating around gerrymandering, right? That is how we have a Black president, right? Because what happens is that, when you're starting to shuffle the vote around, right? And you're putting Blacks in areas with woke whites, who are now, this is not the time.
Go ahead.
So gerrymandering doesn't affect presidential elections.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry, someone heard me from the background. And so, he just threw me completely off. But no, so what, he threw me all the way off for a second. I'm sorry.
Okay.
When you look at minority majority places, right, and then you start to shuffle Black votes into those areas, it's really important that we make sure that we got to get to talk about gerrymandering, right? Because that's what this conversation should be about when we talk about the Black vote, right? It's about gerrymandering. It's about how we're lining up and districting those Black votes, right? And which happens every 10 years, right? This starts at the legislative level. And so at that time, we were at a period in our time in 2008 when we had a majority Democratic state legislatures who were able to kind of create the gerrymandering that allowed for a Black president to be in office.
So let's talk about
gerrymandering does not affect.
Craig, hold that thought. Let's talk about gerrymandering here for a minute, because according to the New York Times, Black elected officials across the country are actually being drawn out of their districts because of gerrymandering, causing Black voters to have decreased political power. I mean, there was just this big brouhaha in Los Angeles with the city council over some of the city council members on record, on tape, considering gerrymandering the districts so that they could have more political power. So
let's be clear,
it actually does happen, Craig.
I can use California as an example. First of all, Democrats have been in control of the redistricting process in California forever. And what they have largely done is, because the Black vote tends to be a largely loyal vote to the Democratic Party, they do have a tendency to divide up the Black community so that they can fortify districts that where a Republican might otherwise get elected. So yes, they do have a history. They do have a history of doing that. But gerrymandering does not affect presidential elections because that is done at a statewide basis, and the number of in other words, whoever wins the popular vote in that state, then those electoral votes go for that particular candidate. Gerrymandering has absolutely no impact on presidential elections.
Y'all literally have the conservative party right now with your election deniers and your insurrectionists wanting to challenge even the
Stacey Abrams is an election denier. Is she a conservative? John Lewis was an election denier. Is he a conservative?
Are you kidding me?
Hillary Clinton.
Are you kidding
Hillary Clinton is an election denier.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not.
Let's not tell lies. I'm not even going to.
Stacey Abrams. Did you mention Stacey Abrams?
Go ahead. Excuse me, Brandon. Greg, let's yield to Chris and let him complete his thought.
Let's talk about election deniers. Donald Trump is an election denier. When you can hop on the phone as the sitting president, you call up the Secretary of State of Georgia and you say, I want 11,000 and so votes to give me the exact number +1 that I need to win that state. Let's talk about election.
But Chris, that doesn't help your perspective here because that never happened and it didn't sway.
That did happen.
I'm not suggesting what Donald Trump said didn't happen. What I'm saying didn't happen was they didn't find the votes. They didn't follow his request.
It's the fact that they didn't follow the request. But since that request, you have seen a rise in candidates that want to challenge the legitimacy of the 2020 election.
Why not?
That want to eventually, that's been on record, that want to hold the electors captive and be able to challenge through the state.
But by the way,
if we don't feel like that, we like the results of this election.
Do I need to pull up the YouTube video of all the Democrats who did the exact same thing with the 2016 election, or the exact same thing with the 2000 election, or the exact same thing with the 2004 election? The fact is that happens every election cycle.
The Democrats did an investigation into Trump for 3 years of a Russia collusion in the election. They denied that Donald Trump fairly won the election in 2016. So let's get out of the way with this crap. It's all political to say these are election deniers. There is nothing whatsoever that makes sense that citizens of this country cannot challenge the government and say, hey, we have questions.
Do you know the definition of what an election denier is? No.
Give me the
No.
definition.
Well, let
sir.
me, Chris, hold that
Okay.
thought. Let me ask Brandon and Craig this question.
Yeah.
There was definitely a difference in the transition of power between Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So what does that speak to when it comes to denying the election?
Part of it was, and keep in mind, in the transition of power from to Donald Trump, part of that transition of power was a politically motivated investigation of Donald Trump that lasted his entire presidency. So while Barack Obama publicly was very civil, his administration and those within his administration, they did seek to do many things to undermine his presidency. Donald Trump, while much less tactful, attempted to do some of the same things. Once again, I think we have a problem when we start talking about denying elections, whether it's Republicans doing it or Democrats doing it, because the peaceful transition of power is the hallmark of our system. But do you
believe that still exists? Do you believe that, Craig? Do you believe that? Do you believe in the?
We also have to have the ability.
But Craig, do you believe in the peaceful transition of power? Do you believe in the peaceful transition of power?
Oh, I most definitely believe in the peaceful transition of power. But I also believe that we know that for people who say there were no problems with the 2020 election, they are just being dishonest. In fact, if you listen to any of the January 6th committee hearings, what they said was there was not sufficient enough fraud to overturn or change the results of the election. Now, when you say that, that means you're not saying there weren't mistakes. You're not saying there wasn't fraud. You're saying there wasn't enough to overturn the election. Okay, well then let's take a look at what were those instances, what were those problems, and how about we put things in place to address those. And that's what these 19 states are in fact trying to do, is put things in place that will make sure that those fraud and mistakes don't happen again.
Yeah,
let's go to a quick commercial break here, and we will return. And Chris, you can respond when we come back on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac on Fox Soul. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. I'm Tammi Mac on Fox Soul. According to a study conducted by multiple universities, including UCLA, voters in predominantly Black neighborhoods face significantly longer wait times than voters in predominantly white neighborhoods. What do we attribute to this disparity, Chris?
Well, I think oftentimes when you look at voters in predominantly Black neighborhoods, they have more problems with the voting sites in those precincts. You're talking about machines that magically just won't turn on. I remember my first ever election working for Barack Obama's re-election campaign in 2012 in Cincinnati, Ohio. It got 7 o'clock, the polls were open. 9 of the 10 machines in a predominantly Black neighborhood just magically were not working. It took an hour to get those online. So what happened to a lot of those voters who had to go to work, a lot of them ended up stepping away because they didn't have the time to wait.
I
London?
want to piggyback and agree with Chris. And I've volunteered and worked as at an election site. And issues would happen where, you would have electoral judges that were supposed to come and work at the sites, but they decided it was a priority to do something else where they were making more money instead of being there. So at the time, there may not have been a chief election judge that was actually working on the site to kind of open up the space and start the process. And then the polls would actually open up later because, something would happen. A person was, unable to be the election judge, the head judge that day.
Craig? What do we attribute this to?
I think if you look at who is running these elections, most often the election officials they're Democrats. I hate to say it, but for some reason we want to blame Republicans. This is what I would like to know from you, Craig. How can we? This is what I would like to know in all sincerity, because Democrats, Republicans, how can we stop the divide? Because they both have their share of wrongdoings. I mean, the way you come off is that Republicans do everything right and Democrats do everything wrong. But honestly, they both have their faults and flaws, both parties. So is there some type of way I do not disagree with you, but the challenge we have is we tend to vote 90 to 95% Democrat. And the communities in which we tend to live tend to be run from top to bottom by Democrats. And we still, the same issues, high crime, poverty, low income, job opportunities, access to capital continue to persist. My only point is that if you keep doing the same, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing or electing the same people and then expecting it to turn out differently.
Yeah, I don't really equate those issues necessarily to Republicans or Democrats, but the lack of apathy in voting when it comes to local issues and local elections.
You ask why there are problems, and like I said, when I look at these, when you look at in Republican counties where the elections are run by Republicans, you don't tend to have these issues.
Majority white counties too.
Yeah, and the thing is
majority white counties.
We're making the issue around Black voting, making it a bipartisan issue, and it shouldn't be a bipartisan issue. A citizen should have the right to vote regardless of what their party is, regardless of how you vote. Like, you have the right to vote. Yeah, but we keep like going back to this being a Black or automatically Democrat, or it's a Black issue or or a Democrat issue, and that's not the case.
So what can we do? I do want to talk about this Black issue because deal with the business of being Black mainly, but what can we do to get more Black people involved politically in terms of voting and in terms of the Republican Party? I mean, Brandon and Craig, you spoke about how, 90% of Black people are doing the same thing that their mother and grandmother and great-great-grandmother did, and that's vote Democrat. So how can we move the needle then? Brandon?
Well, I think that people like myself, people like Craig and others who are giving Black people a different presentation and saying, look, you don't have to be a Democrat. There's another party that offer things and solutions that will be more beneficial for your community. And I think we have to do introspection. We can't sit here and always talk about the white man and white people and all this other stuff. There's a lot of things that we can do in our own communities. We need to get our own people out to vote. We need to help some people that we know to register to vote in these inner city communities. We need to champion that we need to go out and vote, that voting is important, all of these things. I went to an event, my stepmama had it, she's an AKA, they put on this event, nobody showed up. Black people did not show up to this event that's helping out in many other areas, but one thing was voting. We got to do our duty to start changing our culture and making it more important and understanding that we have leverage if we don't just vote for one side. We need to consider both parties and challenge them both to represent our community well. If we don't do
Chris,
that, we're going to
happens?
get the same results.
What happens, Chris, if all of these Black people who are voting Democrat, what happens if they all vote Republican one year? What happens?
Well, I think you would see a seismic shift because you would probably see Republicans roll back some of these restrictions that they have put out there. And so I think that's the root of the problem. If we're talking about, it's not a Black or white issue, we just want Americans to be able to vote, then what is the problem in expanding vote by mail? What is the problem in allowing weekend access earlier for early voting? What is the problem of making Election Day a federal holiday so anybody can go vote? We're talking about the United States of America.
What is the problem with making an Election Day a federal holiday? Are you against that, Brandon?
No, I think that's a great idea to make it a fair. Everybody should have that day off so they can actually go out and vote. But the mail-in and some of those other avenues of voting can cause a lot of fraud to happen. So I think that it is invaluable for us to maintain integral, voting process. But also, I'm for expanding things like having it to be a federal holiday so people can have that day off to make sure they have enough time that they can show up and they can vote.
Craig, you in agreement with a federal holiday here?
Oh, I'm definitely in agreement with it. What I think we ought to do is make sure that if we're going to do this, once again, the law that's being proposed right now, as well as the 1964 Voting Rights Act, it only affects certain states. So if you're going to put restrictions on voting, if you're going to make voting one, if you're going to limit states' ability to be able to make decisions about their elections, then it needs to affect all states, not just certain states that happen to be run by Republicans.
Craig, please tell us about the projects that you've got coming up so we can stay tuned to you.
Yes. Well, I host a daily program from 2 o'clock Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern called The Rundown, 2A News and Conservative Views. We're also going to be launching a new program called The New Underground Railroad, talking about issues of the day, largely from a non-traditional African-American perspective, basically, well, conservative perspective.
Yeah, and I love your show because I love hearing different aspects. Because we can't really come to conclusions until we have all of the facts and all of the sides. And I think some of us come to conclusions a little too soon.
If I might say, your show is such a rarity, and I appreciate the fact that you do have people from differing perspectives on. I think this is the sort of dialogue that we need to see more of, not just here, but in general.
Thank you so much, Craig. Brandon, come on, talk to me. The Officer Tatum Show and podcast.
Yes, Officer Tatum Show podcast from 3 to 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You can get it if you go to theofficertatum.com. You can click on it, watch it. It's syndicated all across the world. Also, Blexit, a nonprofit organization. Candace Owens and I started Blexit, and we're in 43 states, helping out in the inner city communities, giving back, doing back to school drives. I mean, we even have an after school program that we're starting. So if you're interested in helping us out in that area, go to Blexit.com.
London, the Baltimore Mayor's office.
I have the honor of working under the Honorable Mayor Brandon Scott, and my office is, I'm the first to sit in my role. I'm the first trans woman to sit in a cabinet level position in a mayoral office. I'm the first in my position. I'm chartered through our city ordinance. Baltimore, this is why it's important to vote in local elections and why I'm big.
I got to get to Chris. Democracy for America, Chris.
Democracy for America has been around for 18 years. We're one of the oldest organizations in the progressive movement. Right now, we're really focusing on just making sure that we turn people out to vote in this critical midterm election. So I encourage you to go to democracyforamerica.com and find out how you can get involved.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Brandon. And London, congratulations on all of that history you've made, girl.
Thank you.